Hey everyone, welcome back to Weekends. Anna and Nando with you. And now joining us is Jacobin's executive editor, Seth Ackerman, to kind of help us, continue doing our post-mortem on this election, but more importantly, strategize on how the left can win moving forward, especially given how our electoral politics are structured. Seth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's start off with your reactions to the news today. All the major networks announced that Joe Biden has won the general election.
Well, I guess at this point, it's not so much of a surprise. I think right now there's celebrations going on outside where I am in Brooklyn, and I'm sure in a lot of other places. I think that at this point, it's the thing that occurs to me as looking forward is that it has been so long now that the American politics has been completely taken over by the whole discursive field, the whole sort of mental landscape of Americans when it comes to politics has been so completely occupied by the figure of Donald Trump and arguments about Donald Trump. He's taken up so much of the oxygen that it's going to be, it's very hard to predict. It's almost difficult to remember what politics was like before there was Donald Trump or even any kind of a figure like him. And it's going to, so there's going to be a new configuration that's I think impossible to predict now. And there's a lot of expectation that this is not the end of the Trump era, that a lot of people are claiming or thinking that there's going to be that, Trump is a figure who's here to stay. He has amassed a base that's incredibly loyal to him. And so, we're going to be seeing Donald Trump as an important figure in American politics for years. I'm very skeptical of that. I think that, there's never been in American political history a president who has lost re-election and continued to be a central figure in politics, even within his own party. Generally, Americans don't like losers. But more importantly, when a president, it's hard as a sitting incumbent president to lose re-election. It doesn't happen very often. I think there's only been something like 4 cases in the last century. When it does happen, it sends a signal to anyone in politics about what is a promising strategy and what's not a promising strategy. So Trump's defeat is going to, the whole circumstances of the election, as is always the case in a big election, it's going to impart a lot of lessons that people on both sides in both parties are going to learn, whether they're accurate or not accurate. And I think one of the things that people are not expecting that I find to be a quite probable outcome is that Republicans will pretty quickly learn the lesson that much of what that the Donald Trump approach to politics, at least in many of its aspects, is not a very effective approach. And what I mean by that is, there are certain elements of the Trump appeal that probably are here to stay in some ways. For example, the abandonment of sort of globalized internationalism, I think is here to stay. But then again, that's also become a sort of a bipartisan shift. The Democrats, sort of the Democratic establishment, the Democratic foreign policy establishment, has sort of shifted along with in the Trump era against the idea of engagement with China and this idea that we're going to have a sort of a post-Cold War moment that's going to extend forever. So that I think is maybe one element of the Trump era that's going to stay. But, Trump was constantly shocking and surprising people by saying things and doing things that everyone thought were surefire poison, political poison that would, sink any politician. And then he never sank until he did. And so we've now spent 4 years thinking that we're learning the lesson that you can do these things and get away with it, and maybe even build up such a loyal base that you're going to become politically bulletproof. And that illusion has now been punctured in a way that I think we have not yet fully seen the consequences of that lesson being learned. And I think it's going to be learned on the Republican side.
That's a fascinating perspective. I think you're right. And I kind of love that because it was kind of frustrating to see some of the more irresponsible rhetoric and behavior from Donald Trump and how it seemed like he was untouchable. But you're right. I mean, it is incredibly rare for an incumbent president to lose re-election. And maybe this is, the chickens coming home to roost. But the globalist message that you're talking about is also fascinating, because if you can remember, in the beginning of as soon as Biden won the primary and he was campaigning against Trump, they both put out ads where both of them are accusing one another of being too soft on China. And that is definitely an issue that Americans should be watching closely. It actually terrifies me because our situation with China right now is very much our own doing. I mean, we moved all these jobs over there. All of these low-paid workers are being exploited there. And then we turn around and say, oh, they're stealing our patents. They're doing this. They're doing that. Well, yeah, you gave them the blueprint for all your products, and you did that in order to exploit cheap labor. And Democrats are just as guilty of that as Republicans are. But anyway, enough of my rambling. Nando, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, you say that the Republicans will learn the correct lessons to the collapse of Trump, or the defeat of Trump, I suppose, because he didn't really collapse. He got more votes than in 2016. But as Anna pointed out, we're both very skeptical that the Democrats will learn any valuable lessons from their kind of sort of, I don't want to say hollow victory because they won the presidency, but they may not win the Senate, or it's looking unlikely that they'll win the Senate, in which case it's not really like a mandate election. I can't remember the last time an incoming president did not have control of the Senate. It's been a while. What should be the lessons that the Democrats learn, and will the left, can we play any role in helping them or actually imparting some of those lessons?
Well, I think, like I said, there are always lessons that politicians learn after an election, but they're not necessarily the right ones. They're just the lessons that seem right at the time. So people often misinterpret things. I think that whether they're right or they're wrong, they will, and they already have, learned the lesson. The Democrats have learned the lesson that the left is sort of a paper tiger that has makes a lot of noise but doesn't have a lot of real electoral heft. They think that by defeating Bernie Sanders and then going on to win the presidency, that they have punctured the whole movement and left-wing shift in the Democratic electorate and Democratic politics, Democratic discourse. That's why I think that Nancy Pelosi and her other members of the Democratic leadership had no qualms about immediately, right out of the gate, making it clear that they had no patience for efforts to try to push the party or the House leadership to the left. That's the lesson I think that they have learned. I think that we're going to be surprised even by how determined they are, how convinced they are of that, and how they're willing to act on it. But whether that is going to be an effective, whether the actions that they're going to take on the basis of those lessons is going to be effective, we're going to see, in part in the midterms. And I doubt. And the question of what the actual consequences of those lessons being learned are really depends on what the correct analysis of this election is going to be. I mean, it's so far it's looking like a very unusual pattern of voting, and it's going to be, I think, a while as the votes come in and the analyses happen. Data has to be looked at, at lower levels, precinct levels. But I think number one, we don't yet really know what actually happened on election day. But I do think that there are a couple hints that we can take. One thing that Joe Biden, in terms of his popular vote share, on paper did not do so badly. In fact, he sort of, as far as I can tell, he did about as well as you would expect on the basis of fundamentals of Trump's approval rating. But the mystery, I guess, then is why down ballot the Democrats did so badly. And the House vote, for example, I think it's shaping up to be Democrats as a whole getting something like 0.2% more votes than the Republicans, which is a really thin margin. If you compare it to the last time a Democrat won the presidency for the first time, which was back in 2008, it was a vastly bigger number. And even in 2012, when Obama won re-election, the Democratic lead in the overall national House vote was something like 1 or 1.2 percentage points. So there was a really, I think, still quite mysterious failure on the part of the Democrats to capitalize on Trump's unpopularity. And the question is why that is. And all I can point to is that Joe Biden clearly won the votes of quite a lot of people who normally would be very hesitant to vote for a Democrat, but were driven by horror at Trump to support Biden in this particular case. Those people are not going to be voting for Democrats in the future. A lot of them, of course, voted for Republicans in House races and Senate races. So that was a sort of a temporary cushion that the Democrats got in this race that they are not going to have in future races. And so then what do the Democrats have to fall back on? Their traditional base is really obviously what they need, the starting point that they have in any given election. But that base clearly has been somewhat eroded. And the evidence is clear already, even before all the votes are in, that, as you guys were talking about earlier, there was, of course, a big shift to the right, big shift towards Republicans among Hispanics in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. In addition, Black voters, there was no real shift, or a very much smaller shift to the Republican Party in terms of vote choice. But so far, the evidence, I believe, is looking like there was a turnout gap with Black voters turning out at vastly increased numbers. I mean, this was the biggest increase in turnout in a presidential election in 100 years. But the relative turnout was disappointing. White voters increased their turnout significantly more than Black voters. So if your traditional base is losing enthusiasm, and I have to say that it's important to point out that when polls before the election asked people who were who are you going to vote for, but then also how excited are you about voting for this person? How strongly do you support that candidate? Trump had a very, very large advantage, something like 12 percentage points more likely to his voters to say that they strongly supported their candidate, Trump, than Biden voters did for Biden. Those signs don't look very good for the party moving forward. And then the question is, what do they do about it?
Yeah, so I'd like to move on to a piece that you wrote titled "A Blueprint for a New Party" in Jacobin. I thought it was a fantastic piece, and it talked about, this debate that's been raging between members of the left, like people who want a Bernie Sanders presidency. Obviously, we unfortunately didn't get that. And so what's the best way to move forward, especially with a Democratic Party that increasingly, or has been increasingly, hostile toward Bernie supporters and Bernie-like candidates in congressional races? And so I'm going to read a few excerpts from your piece so the audience kind of gets a little taste of what you wrote, but I highly recommend that everyone read the full piece. I guarantee you'll love it. You write, advocates of third-party politics who back Sanders in the primaries, like Seattle Council member Shama Sawant, went on to support Jill Stein's Green Party candidacy. Meanwhile, longstanding opponents of the third-party route, like Democratic Socialist columnist Harold Meyerson, have argued that the left should focus on trying to change the Democratic Party from within. Others have called for a different approach, standing neither wholly inside nor wholly outside the Democratic Party, but few concrete proposals have been discussed so far. This political moment offers a chance to fill in some of these blanks to advance new electoral strategies for an independent left-wing party rooted in the working class. So you argue that we need to challenge the character of America, like America's political system or party system, and the repressive laws that undergird it. And so what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah. So the first point to note is that America has a two-party system, as everybody knows. A lot of people, I think, that have a misconception about why that is. There's a belief that we have a two-party system because we have like a first past the post electoral system. We don't have proportional representation. That's something you often hear as like an explanation. So other countries, they'll have a proportional representation system where if a party gets 7% of the vote, then it'll get 7% of the seats in the parliament, and we don't have that kind of system. That's a real misconception, because the reality is that there are a lot of countries that have first past the post electoral systems, and it's true that on balance, that kind of an electoral system will tend to reduce the number of effective parties and push things more towards in the direction of a two-party system. But the United States is completely unique in the extent to which two parties completely dominate the political scene. So, if you look, anybody can just go to Wikipedia and look up the vote shares of parties other than like the Labour or the Conservatives in Britain in the last general election, and even more so in the previous general election, in all the different constituencies, 650 or so House of Commons constituencies, and you'll see that there's, first of all, an enormous number of quote unquote third parties in Britain. Obviously, the biggest is the Liberal Democrats, which is a party that has roots going back a long time. They used to be one of the two major parties, essentially. But there's a million others, and including a few that actually have had an effect on the political scene, the Green Party, the UKIP. So what is the effect of that? The effect of that is that when you have a more competitive political system where the two parties feel like they're at the very least their votes can be sort of eroded from the sides, it forces them to keep an eye on dissident political movements and dissident political ideas. It creates the kind of competitive pressure that you would expect. In the United States, we have a history of ballot laws, which is not a subject that's particularly sexy or that people tend to focus or tend to spend a lot of time thinking about. But we have, going back more than a century, a set of very unique laws about who can get on the ballot and how you get on the ballot. And the effect of those laws was intended to, and has actually had the effect of making the United States one of the most, probably the most purely monolithically two-party system in the world. It's very difficult to get on the ballot. It's not that third parties don't get on the ballot, it's that the hoops that they have to jump through make it so that a third party basically will only get on the ballot if it's made up of people who are willing to basically devote their entire lives, careers, and all of their party activity to just the task of getting on the ballot. And so you can imagine how effective parties like that are going to be. You get the sort of results that you'd expect. So what do you do in a situation where you have such an inability to exert real competitive pressure on the parties if you're dissatisfied with where they are, as we are with the Democratic Party and of course the Republican Party? What do you do? So we have a substitute for that in theory, which is the primary system. And so we have, it's also unusual, we have competitive primaries that are open to anyone who wants to, quote unquote, enroll in the party just by putting their, checking a box on their voter registration form and saying they're a Democrat. There's no membership, there's no real membership of a political party in the United States. You don't become a member of the Democratic Party by paying dues and going to meetings and having a vote or a say in anything except for the selection of the candidates. What I proposed in that piece, which was a few years ago, is that the left could and should take advantage of the primary system, not in the traditional way, which is the way that's sort of encouraged by people who think that the left ought to sort of join the Democrats and change it from within, which is essentially a kind of race by race, candidate by candidate approach, which has been done for decades. You have individual progressive or left-wing candidates running in particular races with the sort of candidate-centered focus. They have their own plan, they have their own profile. So you've got a lot of people over the years, whether it's like Paul Wellstone back in the 90s or Ted Kennedy challenging Jimmy Carter. You have a history of those kinds of insurgent candidates, but they always were assimilated. Their political profile was assimilated into the Democratic Party completely. There was no, Paul Wellstone was Paul Wellstone, and Ted Kennedy was Ted Kennedy. There was no lasting institutional continuity that could help create a sort of a third pole or a third political identity that ordinary people could tap into. That's how political ideas spread to large millions of people, most of whom don't spend their whole lives, refreshing Twitter or thinking about politics, learning about politics. It happens through party identities and party images. That's how people get a sense of what are the different ways you can be political, the different political ideas you can have. And if you sort of willingly absorb, if the left willingly sort of absorbs itself and its image blends into the Democratic Party and sort of tries on a case-by-case, candidate-by-candidate basis to present alternatives. Those alternatives may be in particular races when you have particularly favorable service conditions, or you have a very good candidate. They might be able to win an individual seat here and there, but they don't have the effect on the electorate of presenting an alternative that can actually millions of people can grab onto and think of as their political identity. And that creates enormous barriers to actually exerting the kind of competition with the two mainstream parties that, in theory, the primary system is supposed to operate. So what I proposed is that we sort of forget about those barriers and create what is in most respect a political party. That is, it's a private, voluntary organization, like political parties are in most of the world, but not here. That would serve all the functions of parties. That would have a mass membership. That would have a democratic internal structure, choose its own candidates, have its own program, have a life and an existence between elections and not just during elections. Organizing people, educating people, that have debates and publications and all the rest of it. But without necessarily running candidates on third-party ballot lines. In fact, that's probably an unwise thing to do. You can run candidates in primaries, but you would have an independent political identity, and so you'd be able to serve. It would be able to serve the same function as a political party in the traditional sense, but which Americans usually think of as it's only a political party if it's got its own separate line on the ballot. And I'm saying all we have to do is shift our thinking a little bit and realize that ballot line is actually more of a legal formality than anything else. Ignore the ballot line and plow ahead with an actual party. That was the question. Is though, do we have the strength to do that in a credible way? 4 years ago, I said no, we don't yet, and I still think that we don't yet. But I think a lot of progress has obviously been made in the last 4 years.
And is something like what you're proposing, like what DSA is doing, or is what DSA is doing not what you're proposing? I'm genuinely asking. I have no idea.
I think, first of all, a lot of people in DSA who are involved in the electoral work that they do, read the article, discussed it, and it had an effect. And in fact, I was surprised right after it came out to find that it came out right at the moment when there was a big surge in membership, right after the first Sanders campaign. And so those things were going on at the same time, sort of a discussion of those ideas on the one hand, and this big membership surge of DSA. And they ended up getting, connected in a lot of people's minds, where a lot of people thought, well, DSA could be, and we can make it into that kind of party. I'm skeptical that DSA would be, as an individual institution, the right vehicle for that kind of work, the right organization. But what's ended up happening, and certainly DSA has not become that. I mean, it's what I was proposing is an actual an organization that really functions as a party. So it would have a slate of candidates everywhere at all times. DSA doesn't really do that. It doesn't have its own program that it requires every candidate to adhere to, and obviously it's way too small to have that kind of effect. But it was intended by a lot of the people who do that work within DSA, and I certainly see it as a promising avenue in this respect, that it's a sort of a test run. It's a trial run. And in the last 4 years, through the candidacies that DSA in various places, especially here in New York, but in many other places as well, have worked on and in many cases succeeded, the experience that DSA activists have developed, not just number one, with just the mechanics of running a campaign and seeing what electoral politics is like and learning how that works, but also sort of the broader activists, even people who never work on those campaigns, but who are members of DSA or identify with DSA. There's a sort of they're learning how to relate to the political system and to politicians and elections in a way that is outside the two-party identities. The whole point of DSA running these candidates is that their political profile and identity is associated with DSA, much more than with the Democratic Party, even though they're usually running on Democratic Party ballot lines. So it's that experience of sort of shifting people's mental landscape of what it means to run candidates, what a political party is and what it means, and what the landscape of American politics is, not just a landscape with two big poles of Republican and Democrat, but something, more than that. And also having to navigate what that means. What kind of relationship should the left, in doing that kind of work, have with the Democratic Party at a rhetorical level, at an actual, legislative level, and inside legislatures when people like Julia Salazar in New York State are, working on legislation and trying to build coalitions. How do you do that? So DSA today is not a full-scale party or party surrogate that I suggested in that article, but it is building the kind of experience and sort of setting the kind of patterns that would be necessary in the future if that kind of an organization did exist. So I think it's a sort of run up to that kind of party potentially.
So I'm trying to understand how you do this without running into the same conundrum that, we've been running into, right? Because our biggest enemies are these corporate Democrats. They'll fight us harder than they'll fight any Republican, that's for sure. And so how do you find yourself as a leftist who's running, right? And you don't end up splitting the vote in a way where the Republican candidate or someone as disastrous or devastating as Donald Trump ends up getting the advantage, because I feel like that's the issue that we keep running into. And based on your strategy, I don't see how we would avoid that.
Well, I mean, the strategy is mainly intended to avoid that by eliminating the idea that if you're going to have a separate party identity, you have to always run a separate candidate in a general election against the Democrat and the Republican. So the idea is you can run candidates in primaries on the Democratic Party, in the Democratic Party primary, and avoid a situation where you're always forced to have a potential split vote, to split the vote with Democrats. So if anything, the conundrum is not so much how to avoid splitting the vote, because running on the Democratic Party, running in a primary, sort of eliminates that danger.
Right.
The danger is really from the other direction. How do you avoid having this entity, this political profile get completely assimilated into the Democratic Party by running in primaries? That's, I think, the question that balancing those two things, running in a party's primary on the one hand, but maintaining a separate identity on the other hand. That's the main issue, I think, that DSA activists working on the electoral field have been sort of navigating much more so than the split vote issue, which as long as you run in a primary is not really an issue.
Okay, got you.
And what about like this idea that say DSA or another organization, whatever it is, becomes kind of a mass party that actually starts to threaten the Democratic Party within, say they win a few high profile races here and there, and all of a sudden start to challenge the sort of power centers. What is stopping the Democratic Party from simply changing the rules for their primary system to make it almost impossible for someone from that other party to win?
That's a great question. So the short answer is that it's obviously not impossible. They could do it, or it could be done. It's a little harder than you would think. For one thing, the rules of primaries, how they're set up and who can get on the ballot and all those kinds of things. And this is one of the things that makes the United States completely unique in the world. There's no other country that has this kind of system. All those rules are set by state governments, not by the Democratic Party. There are a few exceptions, but they're sort of at the margins aspects in certain states of the process that are sort of delegated to a party organization. But for the most part, the primaries are run by the government. That's in itself completely unique. And all the rules are set by state governments. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the rules can't be changed to have that effect. But then you have to sort of, well, first of all, you have to remember that would mean that Democrats control the state legislature and the governorship, and they're able to sort of formulate a consensus within the party to do this. which is not always so easy. But then you have to remember that they have to deal with the consequences of that. So then what kinds of things would they have to do in order to accomplish that? And I think it's a really good question, because these are the kinds of situations you have to game out in the future about how the mainstream party will respond. The way they would have to do that is, for example, pass a law that says that the state party convention decides who the candidates are, who the nominees are, rather than a primary where anybody can vote. That's the system. That's basically the old system from like more than 100 years ago that the primary system replaced. And I think there's still like 1 or 2 states that, at least for some offices, still don't have primaries, have binding primaries. They still have a state convention that makes the decision. But then, from the point of view of the Democratic establishment, that creates its own problems. If the state convention makes the decision, then that means who's the state convention? It's the activists who become delegates, and local party leaders, county party activists who get elected in turn as delegates to the state convention. And so, in other words, what you've done is you've taken the decision out of the hands of a broad primary that anyone can participate in, which gives groups like DSA the opportunity to intervene in the party in ways that the mainstream party doesn't like. But if you would shift that to, making it the party, quote unquote, who gets to make those decisions, then you create an enormous incentive for the left, for DSA, but also really for anybody to try to then take over the party. Right now, taking over the party organization of the Democratic Party, for example, in any state, there's not much of an incentive to do it because they don't really get to decide very much. But once you make that convention sort of the power that gets to decide what the party is, writes the program then becomes really binding, decides who the candidates are. Once the party organization becomes actually powerful, which it isn't now, you're going to have an influx of people trying to take over that party, hopefully from the left, but maybe from somewhere else. That's something that I think that the Democratic leadership, the mainstream Democrats, absolutely do not want. They prefer, even as annoying as it is, to have a sort of an open system where people like in DSA can go and run their own candidates and try to win election. They prefer that kind of diffuse system, which to a system where it really is just about how many people on the ground you can get into that meeting, to vote in that meeting. That encourages and it strengthens the hands of activists more than anything else. Primaries, at least you can sort of try to buy the primary with money. You buy a lot of TV ads to promote your centrist candidate. That's a relatively good deal for them. A bad deal is one in which all you have to do is have enough activists go to every meeting, take over the party. That's something that they don't want to see. They don't want to have to deal with that. Right now, the state parties, the Democratic Party in general, is the bastion of the centrists, and they like it that way.
Yeah. Everyone check out Seth Ackerman's piece, A Blueprint for a New Party. I know that it's a few years old, but I think it's incredibly relevant, following this general election. Seth, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Hopefully you'll come back soon.
Thank you.